Imagine your mind as a bustling city, teeming with conflicts, negotiations, and resolutions. At the heart of this city lie three powerful entities: the id, the ego, and the superego. Sigmund Freud, the pioneering genius behind psychoanalysis, introduced this captivating triad to unlock the mysteries of human behavior and the intricate workings of our psyche. The id, representing our raw, untamed instincts, screams for immediate pleasure and gratification. It's the wild child within us, operating without any regard for consequences. Enter the ego, the pragmatic diplomat, tasked with negotiating the id's demands with the harsh realities of the world. The ego seeks balance, striving to find socially acceptable ways to satisfy our primal urges. Overseeing this complex interplay is the superego, our internalized moral compass, relentlessly enforcing the ideals and values we've absorbed from society and upbringing. In Freud's vision, the psyche is a battleground where these three forces constantly vie for dominance, creating a dynamic tension that shapes our thoughts, behaviors, and mental health. A harmonious balance among the id, ego, and superego is the hallmark of psychological well-being. When these forces are in sync, we navigate life smoothly, fulfilling our desires within the bounds of reality and morality. However, when one component overpowers the others, it can lead to psychological turmoil, manifesting as anxiety, neuroses, or even more severe mental disorders. Freud's tripartite theory of the psyche. In Freud's model, the id, ego, and superego coexist and are in constant interplay. The id represents the primal desires. The ego mediates between these desires and reality, and the superego imposes moral standards. This dynamic interaction ensures that no single component dominates, maintaining a balance that is crucial for psychological health. As Freud states, the functional importance of the ego is manifested in the fact that normally control over the approaches to motility devolves upon it. Thus, in its relation to the id, it is like a man on horseback who has to hold in check the superior strength of the horse, with this difference that the rider tries to do so with his own strength while the ego uses borrowed forces. The ego and the id, 1923. Balance in the psyche. Psychological equilibrium is achieved when the id, ego, and superego are all functioning without one overpowering the others. If any component is missing or dysfunctional, it disrupts the overall balance, underscoring their interdependence. Freud emphasizes the ego represents what may be called reason and common sense, in contrast to the id, which contains the passions, the ego and the id. 1923. Psychoanalytic development. The development of the psyche is a reinforcing cycle where the id's desires drive the ego to find rational means to satisfy them. The ego's interaction with reality shapes the superego, and the superego's moral constraints modulate the id's impulses. Freud illustrates this by stating, the superego retains the character of the father, while the more powerful the Oedipus complex was, and the more rapidly it succumbed to repression under the influence of authority, religious teaching, schooling, and reading, the stricter will be the domination of the superego over the ego later on in the form of conscience, or perhaps of an unconscious sense of guilt, the ego and the id. 1923. Dysfunctional feedback loops. Dysfunction in one component of the psyche leads to a breakdown in the others. For instance, a weak ego cannot mediate between the id and superego, resulting in overall psychological disturbance. Freud acknowledges this interconnectedness by noting the ego is not master in its own house. A difficulty in the path of psychoanalysis, 1917. Causal developmental relationships. Freud's theory of psychosexual development posits that each stage builds on the previous one. Experiences in the oral stage influence the anal stage, which in turn affects the phallic stage. Failure in early stages can lead to issues in later stages, highlighting a causal relationship. Freud famously remarked, "Anatomy is destiny, analysis, terminable and interminable," 1937. Regression. Under stress, individuals may regress to earlier developmental stages. For example, failure in the phallic stage can lead to a resurgence of behaviors from the anal stage. Freud describes this regression. The ego may plunge into a state of almost complete paralysis, as occurs in some traumatic neuroses, or it may react to danger by resorting to regressive behavior, reverting to earlier, more infantile stages of development. Beyond the pleasure principle, 1920. Dream analysis. In Freud's theory of dreams, latent content, which are unconscious desires, transforms into symbolic manifest content. This manifest content is then interpreted by the conscious mind. If the latent content is not addressed, it results in unresolved symbolic manifestations. Freud asserts the interpretation of dreams is the royal road to a knowledge of the unconscious activities of the mind. The interpretation of dreams, 1900. Psychosexual fixation. Fixation in a later stage of development can lead to unresolved issues from earlier stages. This retrospective influence underscores the need to address problems at all stages of development. Freud states, fixation is a lingering attachment to earlier psychosexual stages. The unliberated energy still available from such fixations can become activated in the form of neuroses in later stages. 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, 1905. Neurosis formation. Freud describes how trauma leads to repression, which in turn results in neurotic symptoms. These symptoms reflect both the original trauma and the ongoing repression. He explains hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. Studies on Hysteria, 1895. Resolution of neurosis. To resolve neurosis, repression must be lifted, reducing the impact of trauma and alleviating symptoms. Freud emphasizes the transformative power of this process. Where id was, there ego shall be. New Introductory Lectures on Psychoanalysis, 1933. Dream work. The process of dream interpretation involves understanding how manifest content, which is what is remembered, is a combination of latent content or hidden desires and symbolic representation. Freud highlights this in saying, dreams are the disguised fulfillments of repressed wishes. The interpretation of dreams, 1900. Psychopathology. If both trauma and symbolic content are not addressed, manifest symptoms persist, indicating unresolved psychological issues. Freud states, symptoms are the expression of the return of the repressed, the ego, and the id, 1923. Therapeutic integration. A balanced psyche results from integrating id impulses and ego rationality, leading to a healthy superego. Freud reflects on this balance by saying A man should not strive to eliminate his complexes, but to get into accord with them. They are legitimately what directs his conduct in the world. Conflict, dysfunction in one component leads to problems in the others, creating overall psychic conflict. Freud remarks on the fragility of this balance. The ego is not master in its own house. Personality integration. A well-integrated personality reflects the harmonious interaction of id, ego, and superego, each supporting the development and function of the others. Freud explains the healthy human mind is not only the result of a successful negotiation between the demands of the id, the restrictions of the superego, and the reality of the external world. The ego and the id, 1923. Psychic fragmentation. Dysfunction in two components of the psyche leads to problems in the third, resulting in overall dysfunction. Freud highlights the ego's mediating role. The ego experiences the forces of love and hate from the id and the pressures from the superego, as well as the influences from the external world, and it must mediate among them. Defense mechanisms. The combination of ida impulses with a lack of ego control leads to superego conflict. Freud explains the ego uses defense mechanisms to manage the demands of the id and the superego and to reduce anxiety. The ego and the mechanisms of defense, 1936. Psychic conflict. The suppression of one component creates conflict in another. Freud emphasizes the ego's struggle. The ego's struggle against the libido is a struggle to maintain its own integrity. Transference. Transference can occur without conscious id impulses or superego awareness. When id and superego align, it supports transference. Freud states, transference is the actual vehicle of therapeutic progress. Psychotic breakdown without ego function, id and superego conflict. Now, Freud describes the severity of this state in the psychotic's inner world. The id and the superego's demands take on monstrous proportions. The ego and the id, 1923. Holistic therapy, integrating id impulses into ego function, helps resolve superego conflicts. Balancing all three components leads to a functional and healthy psyche. Freud underscores the goal of psychoanalysis. The task of making conscious the most hidden recesses of the mind is the task of psychoanalysis. Mental breakdown. Ego failure leads to id and superego dysfunction. Freud highlights the ultimate result of unchecked inner conflict. The destruction of the ego is the culmination of the death drive, beyond the pleasure principle, 1920. Freud's legacy is not just in diagnosing and treating mental illness, but in offering a comprehensive theory that bridges the gap between our instinctual drives, rational thoughts, and moral values. His work continues to inform contemporary psychology, providing a foundation for therapeutic practices aimed at achieving a harmonious and integrated psyche. Freud's exploration of psychosexual development, defense mechanisms, and dream analysis further enriches our understanding of how the id, ego, and superego interact over time. His work on the stages of development emphasizes the causal relationships and potential regressions that shape our personalities and influence our mental health. Freud's assertion that anatomy is destiny highlights the profound impact of early experiences on later psychological states. The interconnectedness of the psyche's components is evident in the feedback loops and causal relationships we have examined. Dysfunction in one area inevitably affects the others, leading to psychological disturbances that Freud meticulously analyzed and described. His insights into neurosis formation, regression, and the transformative power of lifting repression underscore the therapeutic potential of understanding and balancing these inner forces. By synthesizing our analysis with Freud's theories, we gain a deeper appreciation of the complexities of the human mind. The balance between the id, ego, and superego remains a cornerstone of psychological health, guiding us toward a better understanding of ourselves and the hidden forces that drive our behavior. Freud's tripartite model invites us to explore the depths of our psyche, revealing the delicate equilibrium that defines our mental and emotional well-being.